this manual is very different. It's at a national level. It's a guidance document. It's in a way a template, but I would argue it's not. It's more of an enabling document is the way to think about it. Similar to where the AASHTO Green Book is thought about as a standard, it's actually guidance, and is more of an enabling document. It sets parameters. So that's what this document does. It's called a context-sensitive approach. It really is context-based. It's called context-sensitive because that's what the Federal Highway Administration calls it, and they're a funder, so heck, we're gonna call it that. It really does get into defining context, a way to think about context. It defines thoroughfare types and the relationships between these. And then it provides guidance and design parameters that look at different elements of the street and relates it back to the context and the thoroughfare type. As I mentioned, Federal Highway Administration was one of the funders. The EPA Smart Growth Office also funded. The project was a joint effort of ITE and CNU, Congress for the New Urbanism. There were a number of us over years and years now through CNU that have been talking about streets, street network, as well as street design issues, and really felt the need for a new national level guidance document. I think there were some people that felt that we needed to do a national standard and really just sort of nail down some rules. But CNU found a partner in ITE, kind of in a way surprised to find them as a willing partner, and entered into an agreement with the funding agencies to prepare this document, which focuses on, and this was a confusing issue throughout the whole preparation of the document. It focuses on urban places, which in that definition of urban does get into things that are suburban, but places that either are or have the intent to become walkable. And that was often forgotten, particularly by our Federal Highway Administration member of the committee, who was always asking, well, how does this apply to that big suburban street in a big box context and all of these things? And we had to keep saying, if the community wants it to be walkable, then it applies. If they don't want it to be walkable, then it doesn't necessarily apply. A broad variety of people were involved. There was a technical committee and more of a policy steering committee. Then all of these types of people were there: traffic design engineers, transportation planners, land use planners, architects, urban designers, landscape architects, transit planners, representatives from AASHTO, which was really important as we move forward. And then it went out for review and balloting, both by ITE members and by CNU members. Again, this is what I was talking about. It's walkable, urban, and that means suburban towns, city centers, neighborhoods, typically with a mix of activities, looking to support transportation choice, and then what we called thoroughfares, and going to the functional classification system, and this was a tension as well throughout the whole preparation of the document. It's about what are typically arterial and collector streets. Local streets, neighborhood streets are not what we were primarily looking at. Tenets of context-sensitive solutions really are a lot of, when you look at the federal policy, a lot of it is really process-oriented, about community objectives, balancing mobility and the environment. It really came out of more of the NEPA process, so it's originally focused much more on environmental issues and historical preservation issues, but has come to get into multimodal approaches, again, being interdisciplinary in how you go about planning improvements to a roadway, and being flexible in the design. So looking at both, looking primarily to the Green Book, but also I think intending to get particularly state DOTs to look at more flexibility. Walkable places and some of the key aspects of those, I really won't dwell on this. You've heard a lot about this already. In terms of this question about public input, not exactly. The professional and planning public, certainly, again, a really broad net of people who were involved in preparing and reviewing this document, but not a real public process because, again, it's really more looking at national level guidance and not really trying to apply it to specific locations. It went through a process where Kimley Horn was the lead consultant. We were the urban design pedestrian consultants. ITERIS was involved in some of the work. Ellen Greenberg, who's now at Arup, was involved with it. The project manager at Kimley Horn, Jim Desa, is also now at Arup. A variety of different consultants, all these volunteers involved. And the consultants worked at getting a proposed recommended practice. ITE has this process that their recommended practices go through. So first was a proposed recommended practice, the blue cover version of this document, if you ever see it. And that went out and was started to be used by people in designing projects and looking at policy, and thousands of comments back on specific information in that document. And that was all compiled, and then mainly Jim and Brian Bachner, who's from the Texas Transportation Institute and was ITE's project manager, they took on the responsibility of really leading the effort to move from the proposed practice to the recommended practice, which now has happened, and a number of us were then involved in the steering committee for that. So very focused on a product, get this manual out so that people can use it. But a lot of process in getting there. I spoke a little bit about the federal highway issues. There were, again, a lot of tensions that I'll highlight as I move through this, where there were decision points that had to be made. Manual versus training. It's always been both. The intent both of ITE and CNU was to get this manual out there, but then use it as a training tool. So both ITE and CNU do go out and do training. ITE has done a number of webinars and intend to continue doing that. Probably at this point, hundreds of conference presentations by different people involved in the project. And there's also a series of fact sheets that ITE has put together. The types of guidance that are here, it gets into defining these different ways of thinking about place and street, and then talks to the methodology. How do you then go about looking at what you have and deciding what street type and place type it is? And then again gives you the guidance specific to those. The outline of the recommended practice, I'm not really going to speak to the network and corridor planning pieces of it, and try and get more into the place and street types and some of the design guidance. Broad breadth of intended users, of course, engineers and planners, but there was an interest in the document being written in a way that elected officials, agency managers, developers, and citizens could look at this document and use it as a tool as well to influence policy and design. The design framework, I'll get into more of the detail of this now. So the thing that was interesting, and this has been laid out as sort of a comparison of the conventional approach to the CSS approach, the main difference here is when you look at the AASHTO Green Book, there's urban and there's rural. Everything that's urban is the same. While I think we all know that it's not. You get out and look at the different kinds of places that we're talking about as urban, from suburban to a city center, and there's a great difference in terms of not just the urban fabric, what development looks like, but if you look at the streets that are there, there tends to be different emphasis in those streets. Then we also looked at the design criteria, and the big debate was functional class. There are a number of people out there that think that this way of thinking about streets is arterial, collector, local, that we just need to get rid of it. It was decided that we needed to come up with a way that we could overlay this system of this manual into the arterial, collector, local system, so that people would understand it who have only learned arterial, collector, local, and so that it would help in implementation. But you can really see some differences here in what the major design criteria are, but functional class does now carry over. Designing the context zones, this is based on the transect zone system that Andres Dwani and a lot of people in CNU use, and to tie it back into CSS, we call it context zones. But it looks at type and mix of land use, densities, the general character, how buildings are placed, how buildings front the street, how open space fronts the street, building height, and types of public space. And there's this idea that the design of a street, as it moves through the context, should adapt to the context that's along the street. Even the right-of-way width might vary. So here's a sort of a visual example, a suburban street today. This is in Charlottesville, Virginia. If a more urbanization of the area moved forward, but it's not particularly intense, you might get this kind of a street that would come out of that. And then if it were a more intense area, much more focus on walkability, shared parking, those kinds of things, then you would get a street design that might be like this. So the idea was, how could we establish guidance that could lead somebody through the decision-making process to design the street that would work with context? Here's a diagram that is a matrix that's in the manual that gets at this relationship between functional class and thoroughfare type. So the thoroughfare types that are looked at are, more in the Boulevard, Avenue, Street are the types that are talked about in the manual, but then how those relate to the different functional classifications. So the Boulevard, the larger of the streets, typically 4+ lanes, target speed of about 35 miles per hour as a maximum or less, more of a focus on through traffic, but also local traffic, tend to serve longer trips, also might be transit priority corridors, might have more of a focus on freight, so larger vehicles, emergency response routes often, and then they may or may not have parking at the curb, another debate point. Some examples of those kinds of streets. Multi-way boulevards are now talked about in the manual. That was, again, something that was in flux as the manual was put together. So this idea of the through lanes in the middle of the street and then more of a local lane separated by a median along the context. So this is that Octavia Boulevard example in San Francisco again. And then there are historic examples of these streets all around the country. The avenue is probably the broadest of the street types in terms of its applicability. There's many more of these than other street types in these major areas. Up to 4 lanes, again, a subject of debate. Target speed, 30 to 35. They tend to have access to uses right there. Primary pedestrian bike routes, probably more of a local function for transit and deliveries. Some examples of what avenues look like. Streets, 2 lanes maximum, target speed 25 miles per hour. These tend to fall more in the collector local range. Main streets, most of what you think about as commercial main streets, two-lane main streets at least, fall into this. Emphasis on curb parking and not truck routes, but that you do have to accommodate local delivery. So these are more of the local types of streets, and some of them, may be primarily residential. And so there are charts like this throughout the document. We were able to keep sort of the full system of thoroughfare types in some of these tables, but what's in green is the focus of the manual. So it does look at, down to alleys and up to freeways in terms of street types, but the manual is really about those in green. And then there are these kinds of very dense tables that get at the relationship of the context type, the primary ground floor land use, is it residential or commercial, the different street types, and then guidance for related to setbacks, so context guidance, sidewalk guidance, travel way guidance, and then discussion of intersections. So a lot of detail in these tables. Design controls were really important in these discussions, particularly speed and design vehicle. This, I think, is one of the most important things in this document in terms of national guidance, and we've been able to use this as a tool in a number of street design projects. The typical conventional design approach is to establish the speed that you want to have on the street, or if it's an existing street, get out there with a speed gun and figure out what people are traveling at, and then design the street assuming that people are going to travel 10 miles per hour faster than that so that it's safe. So this is getting back to the bears talking to each other at the beginning of this. Well, there's this idea that as this document was being prepared, we all of a sudden found people from AASHTO and others saying, yeah, this target speed thing, that's what we need to be doing, because this old method really isn't safe. That if we want people to travel at 25 miles per hour, we need to design the street for 25 miles per hour. And we've been able to use that on a number of street projects to make a difference in all of those detailed geometries of the street design so that the street isn't being designed to allow people to drive 10 miles per hour faster. I mean, you still can. There's so much leeway in this guidance that you could still safely travel at probably 10 miles per hour faster, but you won't hopefully see people driving at 25, sort of plus kind of speeds over the intended speed limit. And because the speed affects all of these elements, lane width, shy distance, the offset from a median, super elevation of the roads, the way that they slope, shoulders, whether you can have on-street parking or not, curb radii, the design of right turn lanes, traffic signal spacing, all sorts of things factor into speed. So a really important breakthrough, I think, in this document. Again, the manual looks at breaking down to these different elements, components of the cross section, gets into some of the things that you saw in Ryan's presentation about breaking down the sidewalk. I'll move through these quickly. Gets into at least mentioning all of these different areas, making reference again to other documents that are out there, pointing out some of the potential conflicting issues. It does provide guidance getting down to the details of sidewalk width and the width of the different areas of the sidewalk. Examples of the kinds of streets that we were thinking about. Then it also looks at the traveled way and gets into all of these and other issues. Bike lanes, lane width, snow removal, stormwater management is mentioned as well. Lane width, again, was a big discussion. One of the things that was a constraint on this document is that all of the design recommendations, the dimensional recommendations, and others had to fit within what's allowed by the guidance in the AASHTO Green Book. So there were people that felt that when we were getting down to the slower, smaller streets, that we should allow narrower than 10-foot lanes. But given that AASHTO Green Book kind of guidance, it was decided that we shouldn't go narrower than that. Speed was another, in terms of how low we can take the speed on these streets, was another discussion area, and we ended up with 25 being the lowest. And that was generally done because a number of states don't allow you to have posted speed lower than 25 miles per hour. Again, based on target speed, the design vehicle, and these other elements. Bike lanes, again, sort of as Ryan was saying, not a lot of detail here in reference to other documents, but it's important to talk about it because of the trade-offs amongst the different elements. A lot of discussion about what is termed in the manual as speed management, because there is this concern that amongst a lot of particularly traffic engineers that we're talking about big urban streets here. Are we really doing traffic calming? Isn't that thing we do in residential neighborhoods? So the language here is speed management on the larger streets. So talking about both the context design, the designs within the right-of-way, and then active measures that can happen to manage speed on these large streets. Transit facilities are talked about. In the earlier recommended practice, there wasn't that much detail, but a lot more detail has been added in the final document. Intersection design is another big element of this manual. And getting into these things about the sort of the interrelationships, again, of modes and the standards that we have at the design of an intersection. So if you are able to take what's more of an auto-oriented street and make it more context sensitive, you can shorten the amount of time that it takes a pedestrian to cross the street, which actually ends up benefiting the throughput for traffic on the main road. Those kinds of things are spoken to in the manual. So implementation, as I mentioned, both ITE and CNU are doing training efforts. CNU has also been using the manual to reach out to communities to offer design assistance. The Texas Department of Transportation has adopted the manual for guidance on state urban streets and state highways in urban areas. The city of El Paso recently adopted the document at a city level. It has been referenced in the Washington State Complete Streets Program legislation, and I think has influenced other legislation around the country. So far, somehow this number seems low to me, but over 1,500 downloads from the ITE site. You can download it for free from ITE. And it's been utilized to provide providing design guidance by hundreds of practitioners. As I said, we've used it on a number of projects and will be continuing to. So the two web pages here, ite.org/CSS has, I can't remember if the download of the manual is directly from there or not, but it will get you there. There are also PowerPoint shows that are there. This is based on a PowerPoint show that you can download from that website. The CNU webpage is cnu.org/streets. And that has information on what CNU has been doing, and they've been also trying to keep up on sort of the news of what's happening with the implementation and use of the document. I think ITE and Brian Bachner and others are continuing to work to try and get the state DOTs and also MPOs to recognize that this document exists and bring it in to their policies to get at some of these issues that we've been talking about, what can you do with the state DOT departments. A lot of DOTs now have some sort of CSS policy or maybe a complete streets policy, but it's a policy. And what happens when you talk to their engineers who are designing roadways or reviewing roadways, they go, yeah, I know there's this policy we're supposed to be implementing, but I go to our state highway design manual and I don't see the flexibility. So we still have to go through the exceptions process. So there's a lot of work, I think, left to be done at that level. Let's see, what other things? I think it has inspired, this manual I think has inspired a number of cities to look at making changes. I think sort of the combination of this giving you that sort of engineering avenue into, oh, we can really interpret AASHTO this way, and something like Ryan's manual that he worked on for LA County, which is much more comprehensive and broad, and I think really does a great job of touching on a lot of these issues, but doesn't necessarily drill down to some of the technical stuff that this manual does. It's really the combination of these kinds of things that can help you figure out how to implement these ideas in your community. So I think that's it on the ITE manual.
This actually answers the question. If you get your state to adopt this manual and your city to adopt Ryan's manual, because you download both for free and stick your label on one and one on the other, then that addresses the question of what do you do when the little street meets the big street.
Yeah, so if you want to have that flexibility to deal with that issue, evidently by the information I've gotten so far, El Paso, Texas is it, because the local is covered and the state is covered. So
because the downloads are quick and easy, could we do that by Friday? I mean, isn't that what it takes to just go get this done? A couple more questions. 3 questions for Phil.
I guess, and maybe this is for all, or maybe people here in the room can answer, is how many winter cities, snow cities, have adopted these recommended practices? I look at it and I see the street furniture, I see the trees, and I'm thinking, okay, what are you going to do with snow storage, snow clearing? How do you handle all that?
Well, I'll answer that. I work in New Haven. They have a complete streets design manual. A lot of this stuff. We work in Chicago, complete streets. You know, all this. They planted thousands of trees and thousands of medians.
Minneapolis
Minneapolis
has a really good manual. One of the consultants who worked on this, Fred Dock, did the manual for Minneapolis.
Yeah, a lot of times providing these sort of what you have when a street is hard up against the sidewalk, you don't have any place to put the snow, and oftentimes you can use these. That's come into the discussion that if you have 5-6 feet worth of right-of-way tree space, that's where you dump your snow. That's where I dump my snow in front of my house. And any others before we go to Janet? Stunned.